Good evening, everyone, to the fourth annual edition of the Interdisciplinary Workshop in Development Studies, ISDS, organized by the Center for New Economic Studies and OP Jindal Global, deemed to be university. This workshop brings together scholars, domain experts, journalists, and social activists to deliberate on some of the most pressing developmental issues of our time in a workshop format panel discussion. Previous ISDS workshops organized by the center have focused on themes such as the role of gender in economic development, urban transformation, a transnational perspective, acclimatized emergencies, amongst others. The workshop has featured experts and scholars from esteemed institutions such as the SOAS, UCL, LSC, JNU, Delhi School of Economics, and social organizations like Radar India, Pegam, and the Soche Foundation. The 2021 edition of the ISDS workshop will introduce the Access Inequality Index, AEI, which measures inequality across states and union territories in India, followed by panel discussions on various themes in the index. The index aims to provide an in-depth assessment of each Indian state's performance in ensuring access to basic social and economic services. The workshop consists of three panel discussions. The first panel discussion, titled Access to Inequality in India, an analytical study for states across India, will introduce and reflect on the report published and have a look at the performance of states based on different paradigms. The second panel, titled Frontiers of Digitalization, Possibilities and Limitations from an Access Prism, will discuss the potential and limitations of digitalization in building inclusive societies. The last panel, titled Conceptualizing Access to Inequality, Moving Forward with AEI, will have panelists from across sectors discussing and analyzing the role of the index in the future. Today, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Maitreesh Ghatak, an Indian economist and professor of economics at the London School of Economics. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Development Economics since 2009 and the director of the research program Economic Organization and Public Policy at LSE since 2006. Earlier, he was the managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies and a co-editor of the Economics of Transition. He is currently a member of the Executive Committee of BRED and a lead academic of the India-Bihar program of the International Growth Center. He is a founder member of the Research Network's Theoretical Research and Development and NGOs. His areas of research interest are development economics, economics of contracts and organizations, and public economics. We also have with us Mr. Roshan Kishore, who is the data and political economy editor at Hindustan Times, where his work largely involves data-driven commentary on the intersection of politics and economics. He holds an MPhil degree in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University and worked in a think tank before taking up journalism. We also have with us Mr. Neelanjan Sircar, who is a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research. His research interests include Indian political economy and comparative political behavior with an eye to Bayesian statistics, causal inference, social network analysis, and game theory. Mr. Sircar's recent work focused on state-level elections in India through both data work and ethnographic methods. He is particularly interested in understanding theoretical principles that undergird the decision-making process of voters in India, which can shed a light on the democratic practices in the developing world more generally. He also works on projects characterizing the social connections between citizens in India and the local brokers and leaders, as well as how local brokers and leaders, both rural and urban, make decisions. I would now like to hand over the floor to Professor Deepanshu Mohan.
Okay, welcome to one and all. I would like to start by saying that the idea to plan this workshop today and the date for it was influenced by the fact that it happens to be the occasion of Mahatma Gandhi's birth anniversary. A lot of the thinking around the work on the index and the conceptualization of looking at access inequality was somewhere in a way drawn from the economic philosophy of just not Gandhi, but to a certain extent Ambedkar as well. But on this maybe occasion, let me very quickly circle back to Gandhiji and something that he said once, just in order to define or put across his economic philosophy. And I quote, my idea of society is that while we are born equal, meaning that we have a right to equal opportunities, all have not the same capacity. It is, in the nature of things, impossible. For instance, all cannot have the same height or color or degree of intelligence, etc. Therefore, in the nature of things, some will have ability to earn more and others less. People with talents will have more and they will utilize their talents for this purpose. If they utilize their talents kindly, they will be performing the work of the state. Such people exist as trustees on no other terms. I would allow a man or a woman of intellect to earn more. I would not cramp his or her talent. But the bulk of his or her greater earnings must be used for the good of the state, just as the income of all earning sons and daughters of the father go to the common family fund. They would have their earning only as trustees. For I want to bring about an equalization of status. The working classes have all these centuries been isolated and relegated to a lower status. They have been Shudras, and the word has been interpreted to mean an inferior status. I want to allow no differentiation between the son, daughter of a weaver, of an agriculturist, and a schoolmaster. End of quote. At the core of Gandhi's economic reasoning and economic philosophy, the idea to create equal access of social and economic opportunities to all people, despite their status in society, was central to securing the economic development of a society as a whole. Ambedkar's views in this regard were similar to maybe one of those rare things where the two saw convergence in thought and action. We can surely debate on how can the state or a society through other institutions can make this happen. But any discourse on studying or understanding inequality and its measurement from the perspective of incomes alone, whether observed under a global or a national lens, says very little about the actual inequities that people experience and live with. There has been a pressing need to incorporate a more interrelational perspective in the development of a granular, meso-level approach to inequality studies, as argued by scholars like Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and many others, which would complement and align with macro findings both in terms of measurement and analytical scrutiny. Our center has done this so far by employing ethnographic anthropological tools, quite often using visual anthropological techniques, to study core socioeconomic issues from a grassroots and community level. Our quest to be focused on issues affecting the most vulnerable amongst India's workforce have taken us to different corners of the country, particularly in the last couple of years. That quest and inquisition still remains. We will continue to document, archive, and analyze the state of being of the invisibilized in the effort to bring out their voices in ways possible. Access Inequality Index, or AEI, is also a step in that direction. The method, though, is different. The index should serve for us maybe as a mirror or an intermediate enabler in times to come for states across India to measure the performance of development, not simply through indicators that show how much foreign capital is invested in the state or how much growth in GSDP terms is increasing their growth performance, but also measure to get a sense as to what extent their own state populations have access to basic social and economic opportunities that subsequently make them capable to grow, evolve, and perceive better as beings of today and tomorrow. This is also vital for invoking and expanding the civic consciousness of India's citizenry across states. Though the word access in general means a way of approaching, reaching, or entering a place as a right or approach to reach, use, or visit, it is here in our report broadly conceptualized to encompass 4 A's, and our team would talk about a little bit more on this. These 4 dimensions are not only critical in understanding inequalities in accessing basic education, healthcare, but must be expanded to cover other sectors or segments as well, including basic amenities, rule of law, justice, for addressing deep-rooted social and economic inequalities. We do this by looking at 5 pillars of education, healthcare, basic amenities, socioeconomic security, and access to justice, but also delve deeper into some of the existing gaps within the access prism observed across different segments of our population. based on the area of residence, the divide between the rural and urban areas, caste groups, class, and gender. More details of our findings now will be presented by our team. And I'd let maybe Latika to get started.
Deepanshu, and a very good evening to everyone. I hope you can see my screen. Can anyone confirm that, please?
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. So to start with, we'll be briefly covering the background and the introduction to our report and the two major parts of the finding, which is equality or inequality of what and equality of whom. These are the two major sections of the report, and then in the last we'll be covering the way forward. So to start with, let's look why this index. Firstly, with the debate of income inequality intensifying, it is important to look at what exactly we are measuring in measuring when we say we are measuring inequality, and how well we are understanding the components of it. So the majority of discourse in the past, we have seen that lies mainly focusing on inequality of outcomes, and we have consumption, income, wealth, etc., and other indicators like this towards the outcome. And in the past few years, inequality of opportunity literature is increasing. When we keep this in the background with the social development goals, the Agenda 2030, it becomes even more important to look at the opportunities rather than the outcomes itself. And why is this? Because we've seen that one of the major factors of why there is a shortfall or deficit in achievement of goals in India, as well as many other developing countries, is that there is underinvestment in human and social capital, and which leads to uneven access to various opportunities. Thirdly, but a very important factor, is the COVID-19 pandemic, as it has touched all everyone's life in this world. It has not only contributed to inequality, which has been depicted by various data sources, various economists globally, but it has also changed the dynamics of how public services are delivered, how the institutions, markets, and governments work. And in this era of social distancing and minimal contact, we need to go beyond physical access or the spatial distribution of opportunities, and therefore it leads to how we define access itself. So just to highlight the three objectives of the report, we look at the multidimensional index to capture inequality of what, or where exactly the inequality lies among the various indicators in access. Secondly, to look at the inequality of whom, or the horizontal inequality among various groups of households or individuals. And the third one, we'll briefly touch upon the impact of pandemic in each of these areas which are covered in the report. So coming to defining what exactly we mean by access. So as Deepanshu has already mentioned that in general what it means, but here in the report, what we are looking at is the 4 A's, or the 4 dimensions, which are availability, approachability, affordability, and appropriateness. So what are these? I'll briefly hit upon each of them. First, availability, we mean that whether an institution or a service is there or not, the physical access. Then moving on to the geographical access through approachability, whether, how far or near is the service. Then affordability, which is very important to look at, that how financially is whether an individual can access a service or not, or whether the service, for example, healthcare, being so expensive that it renders the service itself inaccessible. Fourth is looking at appropriateness, which itself is a broader a group or a bucket where we are putting timeliness, effectiveness, or adequacy of the service or the institution infrastructure which is available. For example, if we look at justice, we have taken the indicators of looking at pendency of the cases, which look at the timeliness of the service being delivered. As you all know, justice delayed is justice denied. So on a whole, this report and the whole framework, we are looking at how far are the Indian states and the UTs are from providing the universal access to all the essential goods and services, or we can call them basic opportunities, which is the target of the Sustainable Development Goals, because it aims at universal access. Even with the local government, we know that the target is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. So making sure that leaving no one behind and targeting at universal access, it becomes very important to look at the current state of the access in the country. Briefly now telling you about what exactly is the framework and what it comprises of. So we have looked at a multi-dimensional framework instead of looking at a single one-dimensional income-based measurements, which are previously we have seen in measurements like Gini coefficient or Lorentz curve. So now we have seen that this report attempts to perform an in-depth assessment from a multidimensional point of view, that how far are the households and the individuals in all the states are from the universal access. We have 5 pillars, as Deepanshu mentioned: access to basic amenities, access to healthcare, education, social economic security, and access to justice. And we have covered 58 indicators in all, which have been grouped into 23 categories, each showing us, or each relating to an important opportunity for the overall quality of life and having a meaningful life in terms of SANE's framework of capabilities and leading a meaningful life. Moving forward, before this, I would like to move to the methodology section. Richa, would you be having, moving on? Can you take that back, please?
Can you change the slide?
Yeah, just a second.
Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about the data. So most of our data is collected from the secondary sources and from the government reports available. And we apply aggregation methodology to, build our index, which, which gives equal weights to all the pillars. And within all the pillars, we have given equal weights to all the indicators, implying that we feel that, all the indicators are of equal value and of equal importance. What we do is then we normalize our data using, this formula, which sort of looks at the value which is, subtracted from the minimum value of the index indicators that we have taken, and then we have calculated the range. All the sub indices index is created using arithmetic mean, and then for the final composite index, we have used geometric mean to come up with the composite index. I would also like to point here that in few of the cases where we thought that where we saw that indicators and criteria points in the opposite direction, we have for instance, in case of one of the indicator that we have looked at is availability of judge per 1,000 population. So here we feel that, the lower the population load is on the high court, the better it is. So we have also, taken care of the inverse direction, and the formula for which is also different. And we have also taken that into account while we did this exercise of ranking. Latika, can you please present the findings from the report?
Sure, thank you, Richa. Just a second, let me glitch. All right, so now moving on to our findings from the Composite Index. So we have, as Richa mentioned, both Composite Index as well as sub-indices for all the major 5 pillars. And this index is focusing on measuring inequality or equality of what. So based on the Composite Index scores, which ranges from 0.67 to 0.23, the states have been broadly grouped into 3 categories: frontrunners, achievers, and aspirants. And we have seen that in the top 5, states like Goa, Sikkim, and Himachal Pradesh and Kerala, which are smaller in nature, but their governments have really focused in developing or in ensuring that their citizens have improved access to the basic amenity, as well as these states also perform very well in other indicators, development indicators such as HDI. So one is that we have looked into how states with various states fare when we compare it to each other. And another is that we are looking at exactly among these 5 pillars and within the pillars itself where the inequality lies the greatest. So we have seen that there is highest inequality in the access of the basic amenity pillars, which comprises of water, sanitation, even digital access, which is basic nowadays, and other indicators such as nutrition and clean energy or clean fuel for the household. So this has been, if we see, then it is followed by access to justice, healthcare, and socioeconomic security, and the least variations exist in access to secondary education. So in our pillar 2, access to education, just want to highlight that we have focused on secondary education itself, and mainly because of the fact that in India we are nearing to universal access to primary education, and it becomes very basic now in the nature, a basic amenity to now achieve the secondary education universal access and then moving on to higher education. So as part of this report, we have looked at secondary education. Moving on to the sub-indices, and I'll quickly run through the findings in terms of inequality of what and where exactly within each of the pillar it lies. For example, among the basic amenities, highest inequality is seen in access to drinking water, piped drinking water, and access to digital infrastructure and nutrition. Though they have the least variation, we know that access to digital infrastructure overall, the score itself is all India average is very low. In terms of sanitation, though there are many programs in housing, also there are many government programs which are there, but there needs to be a lot of work, and we can see that none of the indicators is even nearing universal access, which is targeted through SDGs. In the second pillar, which talks about the healthcare, we have seen all the indicators towards all the dimensions, looking at the affordability, looking at infrastructure, the human resources which are available, and how exactly how approachable are the services. So in the slide, though, we have covered only few of the indicators. The detailed list of indicators we have in our report, and in the dearth of time, we are not covering all. There exists a huge inequality in terms of both affordability and availability of crucial infrastructure such as beds. And this has also been highlighted in the terms of COVID-19 pandemic, where we have seen that the Indian scenario state in terms of healthcare is dismal, and access needs to be improved in all the aspects. If we look at the institutional births and the antenatal care, we see that because of the focus of the government since independence on maternal and child healthcare, these are the indicators which do a bit better in terms of how equal they are among the states. Third pillar, which is access to secondary school or secondary school education. we see that digital readiness of the schools, which is very important to look at in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and a situation where students require to sit at home and learn. But when we look at the infrastructure which is already available in the schools, we see that the situation is a bit dismal, and the all India average, as you can see, approximately 38% of the schools have computer facility which is functional, and 22% of the schools have internet facility which can be helpful in providing digital education or e-schooling to the students sitting at their home. And when we look at indicators such as schools with a girls' toilet, this is something where we see that all India average is 93.92% and almost nearing universal access. And this is the bright side towards the fact that the recent focus of the government through Swachh Bharat Mission and other state level initiatives, that this has improved a lot. And people-teacher ratio, which is an indicator of what is the quality of the education which is imparted, this is also a bright side of the picture. Fourth pillar is socioeconomic security. So what do we mean by socioeconomic security? We have covered three aspects. One is access to financial services, or we can also say financial inclusion. Second is the economic security through means of access to decent work. And decent work covers not only having work, but also access to social security benefits and looking at unskilled work through Manrega, which is for the rural parts of the country. And third is looking at the social security benefits as a separate indicator as well. So here we see that India fares much better in terms of equal access to bank accounts, and also in terms of the coverage of the commercial banks. There is a positive note to these figures. But when we look at access to public assistance to disabled, I should say Divyang, we see that India needs to do a lot, and there is a high inequality even among the states in this regard. Last pillar is access to justice. So what we have covered in justice are four institutions. It is judiciary, prisons, legal aid institutions, and police. So these all four have been looked as part of access to justice. And we see that among the states, the highest inequality lies in prison occupancy and access to digital infrastructure. We have measured access to digital infrastructure through the services which are available through various citizen portals in the states. And services, just judiciary or legal services which are available. And the state of the police availability or police coverage, it is one of the lowest in the world, and the coverage needs to be extended a lot. And also when we look at the representation of the women in both police as well as judiciary, it is not an eye opener. I would say it has been since long that the women judges, the women are less represented in these institutions. Recently, we had three women judges appointed in the Supreme Court, and that makes a total of 11 in the past 71 years.
Latika will have to maybe just...
So Richa, I would pass on to you now.
Thanks, Latika. So, while looking at inequality between the state was important from academic perspective and from the ranking point of view, what we also feel is that pictures remain incomplete, if we don't have, we don't delve into the measuring or commenting on how within the states, the location of the state, gender you belong, and to which categories of caste one belong to also plays an important role in accessing some of the opportunities. And our analysis, though dependent on the desk-based research, depicts that the country is in not so pleasant situation. As you all know, that majority of India lives in village, and the data which is presented on the screen depicts huge disparities between accessing opportunities between urban and rural areas. So while we may have improved over the years on some of these metrics, the fact that we are still discussing these issues today is something that we need to ponder upon. Government have been putting a lot of efforts in creating schemes, and but does the intervention truly benefiting the society as a whole is something that we also wanted to highlight through this academic exercise. Good quality water, housing, sanitation still seems to be a distant dream for many people, especially living in rural areas. Even in some of the urban pockets, we see that the situation is grim. In fact, in one of the ethnographic studies done in Kapashera, we find instances of community sharing of toilets and drinking water, and cramped building structure where in one room 10 people are sharing the room, and there was poor ventilation, and which also in the pandemic time is led to a lot of cases observed in Kapashera. Also in next slide, Latika, on the healthcare, we see that there exist a lot of asymmetries between rural and urban area, and in the pandemic also revealed major creaks in the healthcare system. We had like limited number of hospital, deliberating medical infrastructure, and restricted access to healthcare. And when we talk about affordability, as much as the Indian citizens have to pay a lot from the out-of-pocket expenditure, something like expensive RT-PCR test and high price charge for mask and contactless thermometers during the pandemic and during such grim situation, I think we really need to ponder upon on some of the major policy interventions that we need to think about while going ahead. Next slide. In terms of accessing secondary school, I think distance plays an important role, which also inhibits some of the girls to go to the school, especially in the rural areas. And what we find is that only 12% of the household in rural India have any secondary school within the 5 kilometers, whereas in urban areas such cases are insignificant, but still, I think there is a lot of thinking that needs to be there, especially when we look at the dropout rates and the number of girls who are actually going to the school in getting education. During the during the pandemic time, also we see that some of the privileged background students did find it easy to transition from off line to online mode, just because they had the access to internet. But some of the unprivileged section did face a lot of issues. Then in terms of, next slide, Latika, in terms of caste also, we looked at, caste system continues to remain an important fault lines in India's economy and polity. And there are huge variations in the socioeconomic status and clout of different backward classes and caste group. Also observed in some of the indicator that is highlighted in our presentation. And, because of the orthodox social beliefs, the presence of orthodox social beliefs creates a barrier to, these caste, people belonging to these caste group to access some of the basic amenities in terms of, very basic like water or community toilets or, decent housing. Even there is lack of effective access to healthcare by marginalized group in India. In terms of maternal health care, I mean, they continue to face a lot of discriminations and are traditionally excluded and suffer from high incidence of, being excluded out of accessing some of these opportunities.
Which I'll have to come in. Maybe we'll just have to wrap up in exactly a minute. Can we just go into the regional disparity slide? Let's move there. Yeah. Please go ahead and just, because this is something for specifically for the panelists that was.
Yeah, this is something that we have not included in our report, but we thought while we were, looking at when we were thinking about the presentation. So what we see, and it is not surprising that, southern states tops the chart, not only in composite index, but also in the other pillars as well. The southern states of India presents a very unique model of development, and they have become the country's economic engines and a bastion of social progress. Now, beyond economic growth, the states have also underground social progress, as the status of women and Dalit today is better in the region. The gender ratio is also more balanced in the South, and the fertility rate is lower, and the region has been more successful in eliminating untouchability. However, to understand these sort of model, which is inclusive and people-centric, we need to recognize the cosmopolitan history of any region. And when we talk about the achievers, which is mostly the southern states, we also need to delve into some of the historical background of the other regions as well. The critics of South Indian model also point out it to be a runaway success. The region suffers from acute water crisis, corruption, and while Tamil Nadu and Kerala have achieved greater social progress and greater level of prosperity, not all southern regions are equally open to reform either. However, within these regions, the marked difference between the South and the rest of the India is in development indicators. It is difficult to ignore that how South India vis-a-vis other Indian regions are performing. So I think that is it, and I will
I think
Deepanshu to.
All right, thank you. We can wait for the way forward. I just want to get our panelists right into this. And the whole reason for having a presentation was just so that we utilize most of the time now on some of the areas that you specifically may want to comment. So Professor Ghatak, please, off to you. And you'd have to unmute first. Yeah.
Thank you, Deepanshu. So I really didn't have much time to prepare slides and things like that, but just some notes here. I don't know whether these can be seen, so let me blow this up a bit. So these are really some notes and a table. So it's interesting about the timing of this report, because as we know that the NSS report on agricultural land and livestock holdings that came up, and it presents some measures of inequality on the wealth side that has come up for discussion over the last month. Now, that's just a way to get into today's topic from this report on access inequality that we heard a summary of. Now, typically, when we think about inequality, we look at various outcome measures such as income, consumption. These are the standard things we look at, right? But of course, wealth is another thing that the work of Piketty and his colleagues, but in general, one can think of any development indicator or outcome. And one can, as much as the mean or the level is important, so is measures of sort of inequality. But I think as this report correctly, the premise of this report is correct, that broadly speaking, though, it's inequality of opportunities that makes inequality persistent, because at any point in time, right? So you can have, say, a bunch of trees of different height, but if there's enough growth opportunities there, some of the shorter trees will grow to be tall trees, and that inequality will kind of not persist. So the question is inequality persistent? And opportunity is what one of the biggest determinants of whether inequality is going to be persistent or inequality is going to be sort of temporary, or even if inequality exists, there's going to be enough mobility. So then in that case, inequality will largely reflect churning and say it will show up in incomes and such, but not necessarily in education, skills, and wealth. For example, inequality of outcomes coupled with high mobility would be indicative of more equality of opportunity, right? So, and again, these are things that I think while conceptual issues were well known, I think only recently we are trying to sort of come to a sort of bigger focus on actual empirical measures of these as well as policy implications. Now, I think my first main point, therefore, is that it's important to distinguish between static measures of inequality. We have almost the annual kind of, various inequality reports coming up, and the rich is getting this and the poor is getting this. And of course, we should be concerned about that. But that per se gives a very incomplete picture. It's almost like, it's really a static snapshot. And to the extent there are tendencies for change that are built in, then we should be less despondent. But if not, then I think we should be really getting at the root causes of the persistence. So that I think is really, so even for inequality, I think it's this evolution over time that is important to look at. And this is where the World Inequalities data set has done a stellar job in giving us resources to look at, dynamic evolution of inequality across countries. So broadly speaking, I think the conceptual foundation of this report is more equality of opportunity through better provision of public goods, services, governance, and safety net. One can have actual decrease in inequality of outcomes over time. That's the kind of, hypothesis or the premise of this report. Now, one of the things that while reading the report and also listening to the presentation is anytime one comes up with a new measure of anything, right? It's a little bit of like sausage making, right? There are lots of things, 54 indices and then other things that go into it, and then arithmetic means and geometric means all coming in. So in the end, something comes out, right? And that is usually useful. But on the other hand, it's always good to think about where a new index can throw additional light, because if it's just that it's a more detailed measure than, say, the SDGs that the Niti Aayog publishes, that's fine. It's always good to have a more kind of nuanced and detailed sort of measure that aggregates over more and more things. So with that spirit, I have only really done one substantive thing in the course of reading this report and preparing for this presentation. So what I did was I took the latest per capita income ranking of the states. So I just picked this number from the economic survey, the latest year for which all the states that are covered in this report we have data on is 2018-19. So these are at current prices and this is per capita income, right? And I've given the ranks and I'll explain the color coding in a few minutes. The second one is the SDG index from the Niti Aayog, which I just referred to, and I think it came up in the presentation about the report as well. And I have, again, the states are arranged alphabetically, and what you see in the tables are the rank. The third one is the Access Inequality Index that I have, of course, taken from the report that we are looking at and that was presented, okay? So what I did was I highlighted with yellow some of the good performers whose ranking in all these three different indices are kind of comparable. It's not like you ace in math exam and you fail in the history exam kind of thing, right? So it's more like you have some sort of, kind of compatibility in how you're doing. So as we can see that for some states like Goa and Goa, Sikkim, and among the largest states, Karnataka, Kerala, of course, and Tamil Nadu and Telangana. And this is not, I didn't do it using any mathematical formula. I just eyeballed it. And to the extent the ranks were kind of reasonably similar to each other among the higher performing states, I highlighted them, right? Then I look at the poorly performing states, which I think both the SDG and the AEI report, I think uses somewhat optimistic terminology like aspirant states or something. But anyway, so I think kind of more literal description would be these are lower in the ranking of whichever index you take. So here it's interesting that I have highlighted the states which are kind of remarkably consistent among these 28 states, and I have highlighted in using the kind of orange the ones that are kind of low rank among these 28, and of course some of the usual suspects like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar are there, and several other states like Assam, Tripura, and West Bengal, as well as Jharkhand, right? So my point is clearly these rankings are not identical. I did not calculate the rank correlation coefficient one, that should have been straightforward. I didn't do that. But I think what is interesting to look at are the states for which these rankings are somewhat discordant, like now the Gujarat, about which I have written in the past, and I think now is well appreciated that the fact that it does reasonably well on the income ranks or the growth rank, that's well known, right? Here it's 8 among all these 28 states, right? But immediately, if you look at the SDG or the AEI, the ranking kind of goes down, right? It actually falls below average. And again, I'm not saying anything that this audience would not have known, given all the discussion that has happened. But I think even among some of the other states, I think it's interesting to look at Andhra Pradesh, that its SDG rank is pretty good. It's number 4, whereas its income as well as AEI rank is not so good. So my point is, therefore, per capita income, of course, I'm not going to state the obvious in front of this audience as to what it measures. We know the pros and cons of, a national income or state income, and what it captures in terms of overall economic prosperity versus what it leaves out. But at least to the extent there were no public goods issues, there were no access issues, there were no governance issues, then per capita income would be, for example, like gated communities. Suppose all public goods and services could just be brought with money. In that case, I would say it would have been okay to focus on income and income inequality or wealth inequality, because that would essentially means people could buy the services they need, right? But clearly that's not the world we live in. Now, for the SDG, based on my understanding, and this is where perhaps the authors of the report should sort of, in some ways highlight going forward in the discussions and in the sort of public domain discussions that I hope will follow from this, is the SDG seems more a level thing. So it's a level of certain public goods and services and certain outcome measures in terms of health, education, etc. Right? And again, I have not really opened up the black box and exactly seen what are the measures and how are they being aggregated, but at least at first look, that seems to be the case. Now, for the AEI, the measures seems to be many more, right? I mean, there are many more, and therefore it's a more solidly and based index. It's therefore, we know that indices that are based on only on a few things can swing very, very widely. And I will avoid making any jokes about the doing business index, etc. But but the point is, though, the more grounded an index based on various numbers, it would be more accurately reflective of what is going on. But if it could be highlighted, that's, there could be level of, say, public goods. If I just reduce everything into the simple conceptual framework, private goods and services, public goods and services, right? And access to them, right? So to the extent private goods and services, money and wealth are inequality would dictate how much people can, what is the extent of deprivation, etc. Now, level of public goods and services matter. Health, education, infrastructure, governance, these matter. In states, these are good, right? The poor and the rich can all benefit. But as I think this report convincingly argues, even if the level is high, that doesn't mean access is equal, right? And we there are many mechanisms for this. So I think it'll be useful to have a sense of if the AEI is capturing, in what way it kind of differing from SDG, etc. There's more of this unequal access aspect to it. That's really I had some other sort of minor comments, but in the interest of time, I'll end here, and I look forward to further discussions after the fellow panelists have presented their views.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ghatak. Neelan, you want to go ahead, or Roshan? Either. I won't pick between. Either works. Neelan, go ahead. Neelan, go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me, Deepanshu, and it's a great honor to also be on a panel with Maitreesh. As you mentioned in the introduction, I do a lot of work on local politics, so his work has been quite foundational from the economic side, trying to understand what local political economy looks like. And Roshan, of course, has been a co-author and a colleague for many years now, and I think we all read his stuff to try to understand what is happening in this country with economic outcomes and economic issues rapidly changing day by day, right? So thank you for inviting me, and my comments are not going to be as eloquent as Maitreesh's, but let me what I wanted to do was sort of split my comments into two sets of ideas, right? So one is looking within the index, right, and how it's been constructed. I don't want to get too technical because I know that's mainly discussion for the side, but I think looking within the index can help us understand clearly what the index is picking up, and sort of how to think about various parts of the index. And then another sort of shall we say aspirational claims, right, about what one can use the index for, how one can sort of go further with what you've produced. And I think before I get into this, I should just say that I can for those of us who work with Indian data, all of us do, all of the panelists do, we understand what an extraordinary undertaking this is. It's not easy to find even any of these indicators, right? at disaggregate levels, putting them all together and then sort of working with them, cleaning them up is a huge task. And so I want to commend you on that. Okay, so let me just very quickly share something, if I can get away with it. I'm just going to share directly from the report. And so you can all see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the index creation, right? And of course, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that I understand this is done is that you're taking each one of your 5 larger categories, right? Amenities, health, education. You're normalizing between 0 and 1, and then you're putting into this geometric mean concept, right? So I think this is the right idea, as you correctly note that you should not assume that there's equal substitution between each of these categories, which is why you're using a geometric mean. Now, I think the challenges, and we don't want to go too far because in some sense every index has its own logic, has its own complexities. But I do think sort of explaining a little bit about what an index construction like this is picking up would be helpful. Let me sort of give just a simple example. So one thing that I can quickly see is if you take the logarithm of this, it will be the average of the logarithms of the sum of the logarithms of the categories, right? So once you sort of think about it on that scale, what is it that is being picked up? So one thing that I can see is that, and you mentioned this in the text here, that you are essentially being much more greatly penalized for being very low in one category, as opposed to if a deviation from the maximum score was sort of spread across the categories, right? That's a key feature of this mean. So I think one way to sort of demonstrate that would be, of course, you can use an example, but you can also actually side by side, I think, put these values and then put the aggregate score and then help people work through an example to explain exactly what is being picked up, right? So just to be very clear for the audience, it could be that 2 states are fairly similar, but in one state, they've really messed up on education. In another state, they've just kind of messed up both on health and education. The one that is really messed up on education is going to get a lower score because of the way the index is constructed, right? And I think there's a logic to that, right? I mean, I think that's meaningful. The other thing that I would sort of say when you sort of think about index construction is that, and you will see this in my university, and Deepanshu will know, Varieties of Democracy, VDEM, spends a lot of time taking a large number of indices. Now, what they are worried about is exactly what you're worried about here in a technical sense, right? Which is that health is likely to be related to education, is likely to be related to social security. So if you're going up in one of these sub-indices, it's likely that you're going to go up in another one, not fully, right? So there's some correlation across these sub-indices, right? Even within the pillars, within the sub-indices, there's also likely to be some relation. If I'm good in one, then I'll be good in another, and I'll be good in another, and so on and so forth. So there are actually techniques to think about what is the relation between each of your pillars, what is the relation across these categories, and to kind of correct for that, to sort of not overly rely on the relationship between each of these pillars and categories, and to sort of get rid of whatever effect the correlation has. Now, my instinct is, this is typically what happens when you do these exercises, the results won't dramatically differ. They'll probably differ just on a small number of cases. But I think it's important to at least try to go through the exercise once, because it does help you understand, for instance, I think some of the things that Maitreesh was showing, that, a certain state has surprisingly done really badly or really well. It could be potentially that a couple of those cases are due to these funny correlations, right? So, so just to sort of see, it'll help you sort of unpack, right? And I think because you've done so much work aggregating this data, right? Actually understanding some of the relations between these sub-indices and understanding even within the pillars is actually a huge contribution, right? Because we don't see all the data at once typically, right? And you've actually done the hard part of it. Okay, so that's the only sort of set of technical comments I wanted to make, because I think, it's worth breaking into the index to understand what it is that your measures are picking up, right? Now, the aspirational content. So one is, and I just don't know, and this is really a question to all of you. Obviously, all of this data, even at the state level, is not easy to get. But some of the data, I wonder, within each of these categories, is it available at a lower level of aggregation, right? Is it available at the district level? Even if you don't have all of the indices, right? It's a huge contribution to produce a district level data set on a key set of indicators, right? And my instinct is, again, that you've probably done some of that legwork. So even if it doesn't completely meet the standards or the goals of what you've been able to do at the state level, calculating within state variation, right? Some of the things that you've mentioned that you're worried about would be interesting. So for instance, we do think about a state like Andhra Pradesh, for instance, right, as having a fair amount of within state inequality, right? We think of many states that way, but that's something that perhaps could come out clearly if one is able to look at differences across districts along many of these indicators. The other aspirational thing, so I want to caution you away from something that I think a lot of academics will often make you do, right? Which is when you look at indices like this, and that includes me, right? They'll say, well, what is really the impact of health on X? What is really the impact of education on X? Some kind of causal interpretation, right? I think that would probably be the wrong way to go with things, right? I think, though, there is something very interesting to be done always when you have the kind of complex set of indicators that you have, which is to understand how your pillars and your categories and your indicators, in a basic regression framework, just doing correlations, relate to an outcome of interest that we are broadly interested, for instance, gender representation, caste representation, other measures of, caste violence, religious violence, and I'll bet you will find some relationship, right? It need not be a causal relationship, but looking outside of your indicator. So when I look at, for instance, what you've done, and you've done the right thing, is you're looking at differences in inequality by different subsets, rural, urban, caste groupings. That is using the social indicator as the predictor and using the measure as the outcome. What I'm suggesting is flip. Use the measure of inequality as the predictor on certain outcomes that we tend to care about, right? And I think it's a good way of demonstrating the power of what you have, right? So you have this great framework to think about inequality of opportunity. And a good way of demonstrating the value of inequality of opportunity is to correlate this as a predictor with other social outcomes that we care about. I mean, I'm biased, I'm a political scientist, so a lot of my outcomes are hard to measure and so on. So this is why it's a very valuable thing what you've put together, because once you can show me that this is indeed related to certain set of political and social variables I care about, then this becomes a very valuable way of characterizing the world for me across space, across states, across districts, maybe. Okay, So I'm going to leave it there. I know I've taken up
No, that's
probably
fine.
enough time.
Absolutely.
But thank you, and
No, thank
looking
you.
forward
Thank you
to a
so much.
good discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neelanjan. I think we'll sort of come back with a lot of questions as we proceed. But Roshan, off to you, please.
Thank you, Deepanshu. Thank you for getting me here. It's a pleasure and privilege to be on a panel with Maitreesh and Neelanjan. First of all, I want to congratulate the entire team because this is such a fantastic piece of work. This is something which had me and my team had the time, we would have put it together. Because I think it is a welcome trend that academics in universities are bringing these kind of reports and indices. Whereas this much time had you put it in getting a peer-reviewed paper or something, probably academically the incentives are larger for you. But it is heartening to see that there's social responsibility involved in taking up these kind of projects also. So it sort of enables and initiates a discussion. And I hope there are students listening, because what I'm going to say is absolutely nothing new. What people here, especially Neelanjan and Maitreesh, won't have known. I think first of all, it is very important that we are talking inequality. When inequality in modern economics, as we know it, has always been seen as a binary to growth. And right now, in India, it's not even a question of low growth. We are basically in an era of zero growth, because the economy has contracted. We don't know whether it will come back to pre-pandemic levels this year or not. And there is a section of economists in India, and they wield considerable academic public influence, who've been arguing that irrespective of the moral predicament which sort of inequality poses in front of us, as far as growth is concerned, inequality doesn't matter. That it is anyway the rich who consume in India, who have the purchasing power, who have the capacity to demand. And for time being, we should actually forget about inequality and put all our eggs in the basket of the rich, and they'll sort of save the economy, etc., etc. I mean, Maitreesh, of course, is one of the most eminent voices on the other side, which I also believe is the same side in this debate. But for students, for people who are, beginning to do economics, beginning to do social sciences, I think these are very troubling times, and these are also very interesting times. So the kind of impressions which you form about the public debate, the discipline in general, these are going to probably last a lifetime on all of us, especially younger minds. So it is very important that we are discussing these kind of things. And like the report said, and like Maitreesh also said in his presentation, this report goes beyond the issues of, say, consumption inequality or income inequality, about which unfortunately we have very little data in our country. Consumption, we should have got some data, but thanks to this government, we don't even know when we get some data on consumption. But like the report says, we're talking about inequality of the what and whom. Should it really matter if you're taking a very hard-nosed approach towards, say, economic growth, development, things such as that, which is what dominate, as a journalist, when I say it dominates the news cycle, it dominates the public debate. Now, everybody's interested about the economy right now. Everybody's interested about growth right now. To students, I would say that these issues actually matter a lot. Think of Afghanistan, for example. If you had the same level of income or consumption in Afghanistan before Taliban took over and after Taliban has taken over, and your business not going to be affected, you would keep earning that kind of money, would your life change considerably or not? And the answer is an obvious yes. So when a bunch of economists are talking, about things such as justice, about things such as social security, etc., I think these are not pointless things. These are very important things. Things such as gender. We know Afghanistan, and we know it. That tomorrow, even if your father could afford to send you to the best private education institution in Afghanistan, and you are a young woman, you can't go. So it's over as far as your education is concerned. So these things actually matter a lot. Like Maitreesh said, it is on these things that the fruits or trees of future inequality or equality are sown. So it is very important that we understand them. And I have not had a lot of time. I've not been able to look at the report very carefully. So I am not the best in the best position to comment on the data work. But from whatever little I've understood, it's very comprehensive. If there are, I'm sure there are better people who are more capable than me to look at the methodology and other stuff. And it'll take more time than I've devoted to the project as of now. But I think once again, as students, and I am somebody who actually makes charts for a living, which is what I do in the newspaper I write in. So I think when we are talking data in these times, it is a very useful thing to have on your side, because thanks to social media, everybody from the richest person in the country to the poorest man on the street, whether you are socially privileged, underprivileged, these are very polarizing times, and everybody has very strong opinions. Sometimes even with data, even with facts, it's not very easy to argue, and it has not helped that the credibility of even public sector data. India was one of the few third world countries which produced good data. We have not actually done justice to that legacy. So things are getting very difficult, and I mean, as much as possible, we should have data on our side, and and it helps that it is officially recognized data, because increasingly the government is also becoming extremely hostile to any criticism. But at the same time, it is also extremely important, that as students, as social scientists, as thinking individuals, we actually know the limitations of data even we are citing. So, for example, when we are saying that this report measures, say, the equality in access to education, and when you look at, say, a middle school or a high school in a village, now if I have a middle school or high school in my village, right next to my house, and say person X who I'm comparing my educational attainment to, goes to some, say, good private sector school in Delhi or any other big city. This report would show that both of us are equal, but all of us know for a fact that that equality doesn't matter. There are some things which lend themselves to quantitative measurement. There are some things which do not, and this is why I think it is. I'm not saying that this is why the report is wrong. No, I mean, there is only a limit to which you can quantify things. But when we are using these quantitative facts, I think as students, as young people, it is very important to keep in the back of our minds as to what these things can measure and what these things can't measure. So that is something, and I would encourage students to look at each and every input which has gone into it, this report, and think critically, how much relevant, useful, pertinent, those indicators are in addressing the concerns which we are trying to address. And I'm not saying this to diss the report. I'm only saying this because we need to always take this approach. With certain other things, and this is probably for the authors. For example, you take, say, access to the formal banking sector, as a measure of financial equality or economic well-being. It is a fact that with bank nationalization and all, one of the biggest goods of bank nationalization in India was that it actually took banking to the doorsteps of the poor, or at least closer to the poor in villages, etc. So there's definitely an element of truth to it. But in certain things, I'm not so sure. For example, the Jindal push entire, yes, it has given people accounts, but think of something like, say, a demonetization. And did the fact that the poor actually had access to the formal banking sector, and did it really help them? Now, one can say that during the pandemic, because the government had Jindal accounts, so it quickly transfer, say, 500, 1,000 rupees, whatever it did, to those people's accounts. But at the same time, when the government is sort of completely unambiguously sort of virtualizing something like this, think of LPG transfers. So everybody on paper is jammed, but when LPG prices are highest in the country and government taxes are playing a very big role in that, the government has discontinued subsidies. So sometimes these indicators might sort of work in ways in which we think they do. Sometimes they do not. And Maitreesh's question as to whether it is measuring equality or inequality at a point in time or not, I think becomes very pertinent here. And this is something we should keep in mind. So for example, the same thing with with social security also. So it says that Delhi has least social security in villages. Now, and this definitely doesn't mean that people in Delhi's villages, and we know what Delhi villages are, and that they are the most worse off in the country. So there are small tidbits, for example, which we need to see here and there. There are only two political, larger points which I want to make. And first is regarding, those are broader political economy points which don't have sort of much to do with this report. So when we are talking equality of justice, things, states such as Bihar, etc., do very badly. One thing which I would encourage once again students to keep in mind is, indicators are fine, but sometimes politics changes things fundamentally. Now, I'm somebody who comes from the state of Bihar. I grew up in the 90s there, which if you find any Bihari, it's a very polarizing topic. So people would either be all gung-ho about it, that was the phase of social justice, and people would be extremely critical of the fact that Lalu Prasad Yadav, when he was the chief minister, actually destroyed that state. I would encourage all of you to read Jeffrey Witzow's really good book, and you don't have to be like, I mean, it's somebody who, it's basically, I mean, you can read every day before going to sleep. You don't even need to be a social scientist to read that book. So when I'm saying access to justice, now what transpired in Bihar in those, say, 10 years, before that, if you were a lower caste person in that state, an upper caste person in a village who had like significant sway in terms of land ownership, social status, whatever you call it, could actually get away with committing injustice, violence, oppression against you. Even if, and it would have been wonderful if we had time series data on these, but I understand, like Neelan said, even to collect this data must have been a Herculean effort. I'm saying theoretically, even if the state of the criminal justice system in Bihar has become worse because hirings have not been happening, state government coffers have been running dry, etc., I am willing to put a bet that for that lower caste person at the bottom of the social pyramid today, access to justice is most likely to be better. So Jeffrey's book is called Democracy Against Development. Jeffrey Bitson. And there's a like subtext to it, but Democracy Against Development, and you'll find it anywhere. So all I'm saying is, that politics matters. So sometimes, I mean, these indicators might not show up in the way we want to measure them. I mean, for example, when Mayawati became the chief minister in Uttar Pradesh, fortunes of the Dalits, they changed. And these things, when they change, now that Punjab has got its first Dalit chief minister, the kind of socio-political gains Dalits in Punjab are going to make, those no politician will dare to take back. And India has a lot of problems, but in terms of social change, I think once a progressive social change has been made, especially vis-a-vis the caste question, it is very difficult to take it back. You just can't do it. Otherwise, you're doing political suicide. The other point which I want to make is, and this is with respect to, because we looked at the caste-wise inequality in access, the rural-urban inequality in access to education, health. Those are very important concerns. And one way in which inequality sort of builds on these things is, think of, say, access to the health system, education system. Once again, I am somebody who was sent by my parents from Bihar to study in Delhi. It's not that we didn't have colleges there, but my parents knew that studying in a college in Bihar and studying in a college in Delhi are completely different things, the kind of academic trajectory or professional trajectory you take. So when that process happens, you are effectively witnessing a drain on wealth. A significant part of your parents' earnings, savings, whatever you call it, are actually being taken out of that state. So that state already has a smaller pool of savings or incomes to begin with. And even that limited pool is being subjected to a drain of wealth. So that money is coming to Delhi. There are colonies in Delhi where thousands, probably millions of students live. And all of those students are from Western UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, essentially states where the education system went to the dogs years ago, decades ago. Think of a village, even to have childbirth, people come from villages to cities. Every city, in India, whether it is Bihar or Delhi, you would actually find localities, ecosystems that thrive on the private healthcare. Patients, attendants come, they stay in places, there's food, etc. And this is also a drain of wealth, essentially speaking. So if this drain of wealth could be stopped, then inequality would definitely reduce, because that money would get spent there, and money when it gets spent is always generates more money. That's one. Having said that, and I know I'm probably going to be making a provocative point here. It is a fact that our country, economic inequality and social inequality are deeply linked, and there's a historical reason for that. The way we have been as a society for probably thousands of years, we never, apart from selected pockets here and there, India has never had successful social reforms in our country. So that effect still shows. It shows on the ground. It shows even more in the minds of the people. Especially people who have had historical privilege. Having said that, I would also like to say, that the inequality is definitely a problem as far as access is concerned. But I think what is also an equally big problem in accessing some of the public services in India is that the rich, who also happen to be the socially privileged, have actually withdrawn from availing these services from the public sector. The collapse of especially public health and public education in our country, outside, the metropolitan areas of this country, is also a story of elite withdrawal. The primary health care center in the village, it doesn't work only because the doctor doesn't want to come. It also doesn't work because the elite don't give a damn, because they go to a private sector facility. The private school, the government school doesn't work, not only because the teachers are incentivized to say, no, do absenteeism or whatever it is. It also doesn't work because there's no social pressure. When the elite are invested in a public sector facility, there is always more pressure and often successful pressure for that public sector facility to work better. So when and we are going to be entering into a phase with demands around the caste census, with demands around extending the limit of OBC reservations, etc. I mean, these are detailed topics. We can have a discussion later. But without taking a side, either in favor or against the demand, what I can say with a lot of confidence is that social rupture is going to happen again in India. I come from a generation with saw Mandal 1 when I was just beginning to go to primary school. When I had just entered university, I saw Mandal 2. And now I think we're going to, when exactly, how exactly it transpires, I mean, none of us can predict it, but it is definitely coming. I mean, the way politics is posited in the country today. So when these things, this polarization sort of precipitates again, when this rupture is sort of widening, I think it is important that we also realize that unless the elite withdrawal is reversed, unless the social elite, the economic elite are actually encouraged to get invested in public sector facilities, inequality and like I said, a lot of this inequality is also qualitative in nature. So if that qualitative inequality has to be bridged, we also have to talk about these larger things. This is all I wanted to say. I hope I have made sense. Probably made the students think a little bit more, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Roshan. And I'll sort of urge you to maybe theoretically also explore this idea of elite withdrawal that you're talking about, because this is something which has intrigued a few of us for a while now. We've been discussing this again. It's a part of our conversation and close to us, but it reminds me of the work of Thomas Veblen to a certain extent as well, where on conspicuous consumption and ways in which there is a certain way of how the nature, content, and form of leisure, the class which sort of keeps moving, and is there some reasoning to where when deep-rooted inequalities exacerbate, is it that certain class then starts off lose that sense of intersubjectivity of expressions and connections. When Dipankar Gupta talks about this intersubjectivity problem a lot, he talks about the sort of way in which a household in Delhi treats his or her domestic worker as against the kind of experiences of domestic workers. And we've been actually doing a project for the domestic workers in 5 cities. This Katni, Jhansi, Bhopal, Lucknow, and Pune. We did this. This was just right after the second wave. Sort of the pressure eased down, and it was like again that study was actually happening in complementary terms with this index work, and there was some very interesting parallels coming in the way in which the relationship between the women as employers and women as domestic workers, and the sort of dynamics between them, where one was sort of kind of perpetuating a sense of harm on the other side, and those intra-gendered notions in the way it was affecting the bargaining power of the latter group in case of workers. So there is something to do with respect to kind of psychologically also looking at this elite withdrawal sort of concept. So I mean that's something which was very interesting, and thank you so much Neelanjan as well for some of the observations. I've made out a few notes, and maybe we'll sort of bridge on this later as well. But this sort of your discussion on the use of measure of inequality to predict the outcome as sort of flipping the context. I think that's a very intriguing thought. We do want to sort of look at that. Professor Ghatak, thank you. I think the first thing that as just a very quick clarification I wanted to have from you is that in the way in which you read and understand AEI, for example, the way in its current form, where do you see that moving away from a static to a more dynamic or evolutionary sense of moving towards ideas as they're evolving in equality? Can we expand this one idea we received in the morning, which was very interesting, which Indranilda, who's one of our mentors, was very instrumental in our work on health, particularly, said that you look at sort of parallelly doing from a political science perspective also certain states on how they're doing on issues around democratization, participation, and see that in context to how they've been measuring here, because you do have a sense of the basic economic public goods scenario. And for participation in decision making, you see openness in budgetary participation, and certain metrics which will. So I was looking at how we can expand this to be able to draw some of the more political economy dimensions of the debate, and look at this, the way in which in its current form and also in the way forward, because everybody keeps talking about social composition. Morning discussion was actually a lot about, oh, you can do a lot more on gender, you can do a lot more on looking at caste. And yes, we were, after a point, we were a little also tired telling that we did want to, but there's as much as the data can, as Roshan was saying, that it can take you. And then you have to sort of look at ethnographic and qualitative observations, which a lot of the other work is doing. So just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and then maybe just invite comments from authors. But Roshan, you'd be happy also to know that two of the authors on this project are students, undergraduate students. They're students from Ashoka, by the way. In fact, no one in the authorship of the study, and it's on record, and I can say this on public, is from Jindal, except myself. Everybody, so one is a person working at KPMG, one is an ADR, both of them. The center is based in Jindal. We received no internal support. There was no external funding received. So we sort of kind of as a communitarian spirit, thinking how we can take it forward. We wanted to see and test the waters. So I want Sir maybe to, or Professor Ghatak to respond.
Right. So even there are status hierarchies and how you address people that might reflect certain kinds of inequalities. But leaving that aside,
I come from Lucknow. I come from Lucknow. It's a very stratified.
So I just want to say that again, Deepanshu, it's a very busy part of term, and because we exchange, we are in touch on various issues, and this report is very relevant to stuff I've been working on in the context of India. So therefore, I'm really glad I could make it. And also Roshan and I, we also are in touch and speak from time to time. Roshan and Neelanjan are both folks in the public domain whose writings, database writings, I follow very closely. So it's lovely to have, and indeed, Neelanjan made a couple of very pithy comments about how the index is constructed, and Roshan's broader point about the politics and the social inequities underlying this are things that I hadn't reflected that much on. So I learned from these comments. So see, I would say, so first let me give a short and literal answer to your question. Yeah. So I would say you don't have to do anything to capture the dynamics except for keep doing it. So in other words, it's like in order to have better data on mobility, we just need to, rather than having this NSS things published and then withdrawn, and then some of us having to rely on S. Subramanian's essay or something that Pramit Bhattacharya did with it indirectly and then use that. It will be just nice to have these reports published over time, and from that we can have a sense of the dynamics of inequality, literally that. So just to be on a lighthearted note, just lage raho would be the short answer to it, to in terms of just keep doing this over time, because from that some of these changes would get captured, right? So that would be my kind of literal and short answer to it. But the deeper point I was reflecting on, and it's really a substantive one. See, if I again take a abstract economic framework where I collapse all private goods to one, say food, all public goods to one, say infrastructure, right? And then try to think about both the levels of these things that people have access to, right? And the potential disparities, so that some people have lots to eat and some people don't, right? Some people have lots of access to health and others don't, right? Or infrastructure, right? So what I was thinking is, and that's where I kind of say I was myself curious about the rankings, how they align along the purely, income per capita dimension, then the SDG, which seem more reflective of the levels, and your report, which is more reflective of the underlying inequalities of the, respective populations, right? So I would say it's almost like you want to clearly, if you have lots of income flying around, right, then presumably it will spill over to these other things too, right? So in some ways, when we want to get to inequality, we almost want to filter out the general prosperity level. Like, just to give an example, Saudi Arabia can afford to do a bunch of things simply because they have a lot of oil money, right? That doesn't mean there is access equality there, or there are, these are lots of inequalities of social or along gender dimensions, let's not even get started. But so the point though is that therefore, suppose we want to just almost filter this out, and similarly, where average levels of public services and goods are high, presumably some of that benefits everybody. But from the point of view of access and inequality, we know there's something more, that what is accessible to a relatively affluent upper caste, say male, is not the same for the other, right? So I don't know how to do this, and maybe I mean, there must be there are statistical methods in which we can try to extract some of that. So my point was to, in order to show the additional value, which in a way I'm happy to share the little table that I did and with you, that it already shows the value here, because if it was all aligned, then we would be back into what we say at the beginning of any development economics course that, and this week I started off at teaching that, hey, there are so many development measures, but hey, GDP per capita is still a sufficient stat because everything aligns up, which is not true. But what I'm saying is that you could almost make that argument, right? So what I'm trying to say is that make the case that, okay, this is not perfectly aligned, and these are the ways in which we could filter out the average income or prosperity. I mean, Goa seems to be just rich, right? But Goa also seems to have, high levels of certain public services, etc. But is there an additional inequality problem? Similarly, Bihar is poor, right? Income poor, public services poor, and also there's inequality. So that was my point. On the statics and dynamics, I said that rather than repeating this exercise, I don't have any immediate fixes to suggest. But anyway, I took too much time, sorry.
No, that's, thank you, Professor Ghatak. Just very quickly, Richa, you wanted to respond and take a minute. We'll have to stretch maybe just 10 minutes because I just requested the item. I just hope that's acceptable to the panelists. But Richa, you want to come in, and then Latika? Any observations or responses as authors to what was said?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Deepanshu, and thank you to all the panelists and Professor Ghatak. I really sort of enjoyed the presentation of the table, and it, really give us a way forward in terms of, exploring that, what SDG report is trying to say and what is different in terms of, how our report is trying to look at. And as an academic researcher, I think there is a merit in exploring. In terms of what Neelanjan has stated, looking at the technicalities of the methodology, I just want to point out here that, we did try this exercise using, principal component analysis also, one of the another ranking, methodology. But in terms of looking at the variations, I mean, we did try to look at some, coefficient of correlation between some of the variables. But having said that, I think there is merit in exploring the exercise. And, going ahead, we would probably, seek your guidance in terms of how to refine our method more properly. And I hope, we can sort of.
Neelan, that's our way of saying that we'll talk more. And all right, thank you, Richa.
And just one last point to Roshan. So Roshan, I also come from Bihar, Patna, and I sort of alluded to whatever point you said. And I think while we were also making the presentation, we thought that, there is merit in looking at how sort of politics and how the stability of the government over the period influence the ranking. But that is something we probably would want to explore after we have 3-4 set of AEI reports out, looking at how the rankings have changed and how to relate it with how the government sort of influence, also delving a little bit into how culture and history sort of also influence some of these findings.
No, and I must add that it's not easy in the political climate. One of our speakers found it difficult to even be part of the presentation because of institutional affiliations. Just the fact that there's a discussion happening which might look at, it's just not currently a climate which, but anyway, what we want to just maybe focus on right now is, as Sir said, Lagero, and keep doing the work that needs to be. Somewhere it will reach, but I think my humble also appeal to our panelists also is that at some stage when we start with our discussion on the next index report, we might want to just have a preliminary sort of conversation with some of you in the way when we are designing not just the index but also our way forward. So this would be next year, not right now, months down the line, and we might just want to reach out. So either it would be me, Richa, or depending on who's part of that team. But the students got that exposure that you need. Before Latika comes in, Advaita and Vanshika, because anything you want to say, because you guys have been, in the morning they presented like a significant part of the report. There's the students working on it. I'm quite sure Roshan may find something of interest to know your experience of working on this. And we can then maybe sort of, yeah. Vanshika, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you to all the panelists. I think the sort of points that have been made, at least even though we were doing such an in-depth study with like looking at all the data, it didn't really come to me that I should probably open the SDG index and see what the rankings there are and sort of compare with that. So I think this sort of brings, what I've also been working on under a very new light, and I really appreciate that. Um, that's it. I'm just still sort of taking in everything that's happened. So yeah.
No, and they were in the process of ripping apart everyone. We got everybody was so saturated by the time this was. What have you asked us to do? Last 5 months, they've been on it, and the students were like, we're not engaging with the center anymore. They're just making us do a lot of. But now that you see, Vanshika, it's like there is value to kind of the work and the discussion. So it will go somewhere going forward. Advaita, go ahead, please, if you can hear you. And then
yes, thank you, Professor. And thank you to all the panelists for all those insightful comments. The most interesting thing that resonated with me today was the comment by Professor Kishore that about justice is that it's something that is particularly hard to measure, especially when you use the term justice. It's something that we had a lot of internal deliberation on as well when discussing, where does social justice come in, where does the quality of judgments come in? And that's something that we unfortunately could not quantify with the data we had available. So hopefully in the future, we can expand on that pillar also further. And thank you so much for all your insights.
Latika, any final words before we give us final few minutes to our panelists? Yeah.
It was an absolute pleasure to hear from all the panelists. Thank you so much once again. And just to add, on the various comments on the correlations we can drive going forward. Just one particular thing I would like to mention, that when we were looking at the definition of access, we looked at the demand side, from the supply side, which is how the government or the public sector is delivering various services. But one of the aspects, looking at the other side, which is demand side, is something we thought we will consider in the next few version, which actually I think captures a lot of socio-political factors which were described by the panelists. Say, for example, how people perceive police or how people perceive the justice system in India itself is an indicator which comes from the demand side of the axis, and a lot of other political factors which are more qualitative rather than quantitative. We have very less data. That's why that was one of the reasons also that we did not look at the demand side. But yes, going forward, if we do detailed surveys and if we look at, try to create more data from the state level as well as the district level, which can capture such nuances from the political and the other social factors, definitely that would add a lot of weight to the index itself. So thank you once again, and over to you, Deepanshu.
Okay, final 2 minutes, Roshan, Neelanjan, and Professor Ghatak.
I think the demand side comment is extremely important. I'll just give one example and I'll stop. Think of NREGS. You talk in the report that where it works, it does wonders for poverty reduction. Think of the right to education. You talk in the report that because RT is there, we don't even need to bother about primary education. Think of something like the right to information. It is, you cannot imagine justice without these three. I am willing to put a bet here that out of and these are all achievements which have come out of movements, quote unquote, non-political. You will not find even one MLA in this country who has been actively associated with these movements and has been able to win an election later. In the recent Bihar elections, a lot of people, academics who have worked in Bihar service, etc. Somebody called Sanjay Sani, he's an NRG activist. He was actually fielded in an assembly constituency in Muzaffarpur. A lot of people, Zor, all of them know him. So he's very popular with academics who have worked there. Got some 5,000, 6,000 votes. So do the people actually, they want it, but are they willing to politically encourage such demands or such movements? It is a question all of us have to ask. Some politician comes and says, I'll give you 5,000 rupees, you do your BA, I'll give you 10,000 rupees here, there. He or she will get all the votes. What is the political return of these? Are very tedious, demands to make, conceptualize, implement on the ground, hold accountable to. Where is the political incentive for all this in this country?
Yeah, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on political issues. So, I mentioned, I didn't go too far with it. I mentioned this idea of thinking about social and political outcomes as something to correlate with the existing index that you have. And one way to think about, I think your authors mentioned that, collecting data, and Roshan would agree, collecting data on political outcomes, social outcomes is very, very hard, right? It's what we do for a living. It takes a very, very long time. And even then you don't often trust the measures. That's why it's okay to, focus on a set of issues. So I think listening to Roshan, I would agree as first place, my ideas went, which is there are issues of hierarchy and dignity, right? That are more general problems in India that are difficult to measure, but can be conceptualized in various ways, right? And rather than thinking about pulling them out of technical measures like access to healthcare, number of schools, so on and so forth, you can think of a more abstract way that, is theoretically informed to measure this and relate that to the index that you have, right? Rather than sort of thinking about an explicit data source, because that is going to get quite brutal, right? The other thing that I would just say, and this is just a technical point, is that I know that you're looking to, in various ways, refine and add data. Please, if you do it, also go backwards. Make sure that we can use the same index across time, right? So otherwise, some of the points that Maitreesh was talking will be compromised. We're talking about will be compromised, right? So, if I can't compare the first iteration of the index with the second iteration of the index, with the third iteration of the index, then that would be challenging.
That's the first we've heard that they keep the iteration as the way it is, because from the morning we were we were being thrown into a bucket where it's like, this is all great, the intention is well valid, but you have to. But I think there is value to that, because the table which Professor Ghatak shared with us, I think that really opened our way of perception on how and what differences we can see across different rankings, and I think that's important. Professor Ghatak, final couple of minutes are left. Any thoughts for us and the team?
No, again, I think I've shared most of my thoughts, but just a lighthearted remark to Vanshika's comment about not having thought of the table. See, this is what experience, especially as journal editor and reading. So we are almost like trained to, and because the report is already very rich, my comment could be, it's a bit like, it's like in sports, right? If the ball is very good, then you have to raise your game and trying to. So the reaction reflects the fact that it's a very rich report, and the idea that you're constructing with all these different indices, 56 or so, if I remember the number correctly, right? And then you're looking at the inequality measures and the way that you're computing it. That itself is a big value added, and it will be cited and quoted, and rightly so. So therefore, it's almost like we're trained to do this. So and it's a reflection on the quality of the report. Number two, Deepanshu, I do think that, again, I am not enough of a measurement or statistical index kind of person, but to the extent you have received some feedback here, including some of the comments that Neelanjan made, etc. I would say you can always augment your report. So keep the core indices, because that way you can build up the time series.
Yeah.
But it doesn't also mean that that's where you get stick to, because some of the political, social dimensions, etc. So there's no harm in having sort of supplements or whatever, and then you build on them. But because it's overall, it's an important enterprise, and I do hope that it stays here. I mean, like some of the reports, like HDI has stayed with us, and so therefore that would be really all I would say. But it's good to see the overall enthusiasm, and I really certainly it was stimulating, and it's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, Professor, I think that's the point. We want to augment it, and I think that's something we'll do. The idea is to have an annual study out, which is what we'll be doing every year. So maybe at the next time when something like this comes out, we'll share the work. But one request I had to our dear panelists is, because our dean mentioned this in the morning, and she was quite accurate in saying, she's an anthropologist herself, is that the study needs dissemination in any ways that is possible to be able to invite thought. So in your own groups or discussions, even as Professor Ghatak, you may have seminar sessions, if you as just a rough patch, if you give students the exercise to maybe look at this and come back in reviewing what it means for us, it would be of great help, because the idea is that we've made everything, in fact, about the index work public, even the raw data and master Excel file. So the idea is that we'll get and build on this. But thank you again, and it was a wonderful session, deeply insightful, and I hope we'll get a chance to connect and again get soon speak again. Thank you, Professor Ghatak. Thank you, Roshan. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Neelanjan.